after night. Listen to the lullaby every time life seems too hard. So close your eyes, just close your eyes. Our voices will hug you, music beyond. The star will shine a light in your eyes. You are loved, little girl, you are. I bet you'll be strong now when the day is back. Waya waya lumio, oye que no me fa. Waya waya lumio, oye que no me fa. Oye que no me fa. Aremo oye que no me fa. If one day you wanna cry, look at the star. I know she's proud of who you've been and who you are. Then run into laughing arms and shine as bright.
Hi, welcome y'all. Thanks for being here this afternoon. All right, let me get my notes up. All right, welcome to our 3D Skills Share on soil health. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I am a bit of a soil nerd, so I'm happy you all could take time this afternoon to join us. This is the first virtual Skillshare in our fall/winter series, and we're gathering to level up our land-based skills. My name is Brianna Alfaro, and I coordinate the 3D series with our Soulfire team. I serve as the Director of Program Administration and Partnerships here at Soulfire. We're an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm committed to uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty in the food system. And before we begin, I just wanted to take a second, take a breath, take a moment to acknowledge all that's going on right now. I feel like in this in-between time, it can also feel like a lot in between the seasons. There's a lot that kicks up, and yeah, we have the election season going on this week, and that feels like a lot. The ongoing genocide in Palestine, violence, displacement happening in Haiti, Congo, Ukraine, Sudan, and too many countries. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and just take a moment. All of this calls us to put our food and land sovereignty dreams into deeper practice. And that's why we're here, to teach each other survival skills, to learn how to be deeper in partnership and collaboration with the earth, and to uplift the healing and dignity of our BIPOC communities. So we'll get into it. I will invite my teammate in a second to introduce himself, and then I'll introduce our featured presenter. You are also welcome to introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already. Share your name, pronouns, the land you are zooming in from, and anything that lights you up about soil health. You can ask questions throughout the workshop. Just put your hand up or put a question in the chat and we can call on you. We'll also have a designated space for Q&A towards the end of our program. Feel free to use the chat to engage, ask and answer each other's questions, give affirmations, offer wisdom, share resources and areas for collaboration. Closed captioning is available. You just have to click the 3 dots that say, and the button that says more, hit captions and show captions. And with all of that, I'll pass it to Shay to introduce themselves.
Peace, everyone. My name is Shay Collins. I'm the Administrative Program Director at Soulfire. My pronouns are they, them. And today I'm going to be supporting with tech and monitoring the chat. So if you need any support, feel free to private message me, and I'm happy to support.
Thank you. All right. This is just some notes about our program today. We'll be having a soil health overview, a section on farming without tillage. We'll go over some information about cover crops, compost making. We'll have that Q&A section, and we'll close at 4:30. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Yoko. Thank you so much, Yoko, for joining us. You came recommended from our Braiding Seeds Fellowship co-director, Sarah, as someone who is just really knowledgeable and passionate about soil. So we're happy to have you here. Yoko owns and operates Asawaga Farm with their partner in Putnam, Connecticut. They grow certified organic vegetables, cut flowers, and a small amount of fruits in an intensive 1-acre market garden. With some previous gardening experience, she started her farming journey in earnest at Riverbank Farm in Roxbury, Connecticut in 2015. They found their current property in 2016 and built the farm from scratch on raw land. Since beginning their first season in 2018, they have centered their efforts and priorities around soil and ecosystem health, which is reflected in their practices such as extensive cover cropping, homemade compost making, and not ever tilling. Although they farm on less than an acre, the farm supports both Yoko and her partner as full-time farmers, as well as 3 crew members who are seasonal from March to November. Yoko is especially passionate about cover crops and composting and enjoys giving talks about these topics and spreading the regenerative practices employed at Asawaga Farm. With that, I will pass it to you, Yoko.
Thank you, Bree. Let me share my screen first. Okay, can everyone see this? All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Like Bree said, I love talking about some of our soil health practices that we employ at Asawaga Farm. Feel free to ask questions as they come up. I'm happy to, before you forget that thought or question, let me know. And yeah, let me just dive right in. There's a lot of content here. This is a bit redundant. Bree already showed a slide about what we'll be talking about today. Between some of the different components I'll be talking about today, we'll have 2 breakout sessions where I'll have a question that folks can talk about amongst themselves, and then we'll have a few minutes to share what you guys discussed. So yeah, let me dive right into a little bit about our farm as well as myself. So as Bree mentioned, we're in Putnam, Connecticut, which is in the northeastern part of the state. We're right by Rhode Island and Massachusetts. We're on Nipmuc land, and we are so fortunate to be on this property. We're sandwiched by 2 rivers, what used to be called the Asawaga River. Today it's called 5 Mile River, which is to the west of us. And then we have the Mary Brown Brook, which is to the east of us. And we're basically kind of right between those 2 riverways. And Asawaga has a meaning of a place in between. So we feel like it's a very, suitable name for our farm because it sits right between 2 rivers. So we are certified organic. We have been since the beginning in 2018. We grow vegetables as well as a small amount of cut flowers. So our first season was in 2018, which makes this season our 7th, and we just have another month to go with markets. But we did have 2 years prior to starting our, selling vegetables to prepare the land, because when we purchased it, it was just raw land. There was barely a driveway. So we built this barn structure from scratch, pretty much mostly by ourselves. And we live on the upstairs, half of the upstairs, and the first floor is used for a lot of the farming operations. So it has our walk-in cooler, a place to store vegetables, and also a place to process vegetables. In this picture, you can actually see a corner of the barn. So half of the barn actually turns into our farm stand weekly during the season. So that's just one part of it. So in terms of our size, we tell people 1 acre, a little bit less than an acre. It's always a little bit changing because we're adding things, little bits here and there, but we are still under an acre. We have 2 structures, which are the same footprint, 30 by 72. One of them we call the greenhouse because we heat part of the greenhouse. So 20 feet of it is our propagation space, which we partition off during the spring. And then the other side of it is in-ground growing space, which we use for all sorts of things, starting with greens and then mostly into tomatoes and things like that. And then ending with greens again in the fall. We just put up this new high tunnel earlier this year. So it's been really exciting to have more indoor space. Although I like to tell people we did 6 seasons with just one tiny indoor space and have made, our farm was, doing well without that much indoor space. So I always tell people, it's outdoor growing is sufficient, but of course, in the face of climate change and a lot of extreme unpredictable weather, it's definitely helpful to have indoor space. But I love growing outdoors, and I feel that it's a little bit easier managing the soil and all the balancing you need to do outside. So we have 3 seasonal employees. This year we had 2 full-time and 1 part-time. Last year we had 3 full-time, so it's somewhere around there. We have 2 sales outlets. So we have the Thursday Farmers Market in Boston, which is just over an hour away from here. And we have our farm stand every Saturday. This is from May to November. So which means we don't grow during the winter, which is intentional. I like to be able to visit my family in Japan every winter. So it is something that we make sure to, it's a time to also rest and do a lot of planning and things like that. So we're still working, but not physically growing anything. So as Bree mentioned, we are no-till. We have been from the start. We'll definitely dive into the details of that right after this. But we definitely got inspiration from Brian O'Hara, which his farm, Tobacco Road Farm, we got to visit. I think it was back in 2015, and it really we always had the intention of doing no-till, but we weren't sure if we should start off no-till. And anyway, it just gave us that inspiration to really just start no-till from the get-go. And then just a little bit about me. I am originally from Japan, but I lived in a lot of different places because of my father's work. And so I think somewhere inside of me, I really wanted to really settle down and set some roots. And instead of knowing a little bit about a lot of different places, I wanted to really know a lot about one place. And so this was, this in combination with my love for being outside and, using my hands and working with plants, all those things kind of came together to lead to this career. But I'd also like to mention that I was part of a CSA windflower farm in upstate New York. And every year they invite CSA members to come to their farm, and there's a potluck and a tour by the farmer, and that really solidified my like want and need to be growing. So that's where I found Riverbank Farm, like Bree mentioned in my intro, on the eastern side of the state, western side of the state. And I was lucky enough to work there for 3 years. And that's when we kind of started envisioning our farm and looking for land. So that's the intro, and let's dive right into soil health. So these are the principles that we follow at Aswaga Farm. And yeah, you'll see that each of these are under one of the 3 topics that we're going to be covering today. So first is to avoid tillage or really any disturbance to the soil. That's, let me see, that obviously falls under no-till. We like to always keep the soil covered and protected. And that is sort of under no-till. You'll see that we do a lot of mulching with hay. So that's one of the ways that we keep our soil covered. We also strive to grow as much photosynthesizing plants as possible, as long as possible throughout the year. That is really achieved through cover cropping, and maximizing species diversity also is another goal that we achieve through cover cropping. We did do a lot of interplanting before with cash crops, but it introduces a level of complexity to, your crop plans, and then also having your employees know where everything is, and it just wasn't working out that well. So we don't do that much intercropping of cash crops, but with the cover crops, that's where we introduce a lot of diversity of species. And then finally, we always strive to minimize outside inputs and try to build fertility from within the farm as much as possible. And that falls under our last topic that we'll cover today, which is compost teas and vermicompost. Okay, so this is our first breakout session. And the question is, what soil health practices are you familiar with, and what has your experience been with those practices? So we'll have 5 minutes for discussing, and then we'll come back and share what you guys discussed for about 3 minutes.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Did anyone want to share anything that you all discussed in your breakout rooms? Anything juicy come up?
It doesn't have to be anything groundbreaking.
Right.
I'll share. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Somebody said biochar.
Hi. Oh, yeah, biochar is a great one.
I was sorry. I was just gonna say, yeah, I thought it was interesting. I was in a breakout room with C, and we were talking about gardening and how like we don't dig, we're really just like building up the soil and like ways to do that. And we talked about some ways of like using like the nitrogen fixing plants and like mulching with those, like green mulching, and yeah, just using like cardboard and things that are like available to us to do that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. Anybody else want to share?
I see in the chat, compost to amend soil.
What kind of compost? I wonder.
Brendan, did you feel like coming off mute and letting us know what kind of compost you're using, or the other person that you spoke with?
There's a group of like 4 or 5 of us all together here, but we'll take turns.
So food waste will be a good one. Food waste for the compost to amend the soil. I like the char. The char was awesome. We agreed with that as well. The biochar was awesome. But yeah, so we're just thinking like food waste. Do you agree with that, or
They're like,
to amend the soil? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, where did you make the biochar yourself?
Yes, we did actually.
We'll
In
talk
fact,
about how we learned it with.
we learned it. Okay,
Go ahead.
go ahead. You got it.
We've been training with different trainers in the green workforce, like every week. And so for a week we were with someone named Cuauhtemoc Villa, and he taught us basically gathered a bunch of wood and started a fire, lighting it from the top so that the charcoals would get super hot. And then you cool down those charcoals with a probiotic tea or effective microorganisms, and that locks in a bunch of organisms and good stuff into the charcoal. And then that charcoal is then broken down, and it should break like glass, and then you would amend the soil with that. And so the charcoal would hold all those nutrients in the soil for a really long time.
Awesome. Yeah, that's awesome.
And by the way, we paid for 5 tickets. Do you want to tell her?
Oh yeah.
We just jumped on one call.
Yeah, we just jumped on one call, but all
We
5 of us
paid
are
for-
registered.
Yeah, we're registered.
Thank you.
All right, happy you're here. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's really cool. Okay. All right, Bree, should we get into the slides again? I'm not really sure how to go back a slide, but I think this is the next slide. Let me just, how do I? Just want to make sure. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh no. Okay. So I think a lot of people are familiar with no-till. I just want to say before we start talking about no-till, there's a lot of different ways to do no-till. It's not one way is correct. And I think it really depends on your context, what makes sense for you, what materials are accessible to you, or what materials make sense. So it's all about context. This is how we do it on our farm, but it's not to say that this is the way it should be. And I don't know if you all are familiar with the idea behind no-till is that the soil is a very complex web of organisms, and anytime you run like any kind of steel blade through it, or you're stirring up the soil, or removing soil, or anything like that, that really destroys the home, this delicately balanced web of life in there. It destroys that, all the network of mycorrhizae fungi. So yeah, the idea is that let's preserve those networks. Those are helping plants to access the nutrients that they need. So as much as possible, let's not disturb the soil. So in order to do that on our farm, we are using permanent beds. They never move. We basically don't really use any mechanical tools or tractors to work the soil. We use very basic tools that you can just buy down the street at Tractor Supply. Our most used tools are a leaf rake, a metal rake, and a broad fork if we're preparing for a cash crop. So everything is mostly hand powered. We do have a walk behind tractor, which is a Grillo, which is very similar to BCS. And the attachment that we use the most is the flail mower. And we use this, as you'll see when we talk about cover crops, we use it to mow down cover crops. And that's basically the only time the tractor comes into the field. So very rarely do we have any equipment in the field. And as you can see in the picture, we mulch very extensively. At this point, I hate looking at exposed bare soil. So it just makes me feel good when everything is tucked in under a nice, mulch. So farming without tillage. So how we sow seeds and terminate crops. So with seeding, there's direct seeding and transplanting. So when we do direct seeding, we typically use the jang, which is not typically, we always use the jang, which is this in the right picture, the yellow tool. And we seed carrots, radishes, turnips, arugula, things like that. So basically everything else is transplanted by hand, and it's usually through a mulched bed, but there are definitely exceptions. So we plant some things every single week. So things like lettuce and Asian greens, we plant every single week of the season, which something like those have a high turnaround. So we don't mulch every time. And it just obviously mulching the bed is another, 10, 15 minutes. So it does add up a little bit. Oh, sorry. What? Can I do that? Sorry, I don't know how to go back, so I have to do this. Okay, so in terms of terminating cash crops, we cut plants at the soil level for most crops. So as you can see in this picture, we had a broccolini growing here, and those typically we harvest for a crazy long time. I think the longest was like 19 weeks of harvest. And then at the end of its, sort of useful life, we cut it with loppers at the soil level. So a lot of times if it's something a lot more delicate, like lettuce, we just use a serrated knife. So it doesn't, have to be loppers, but it's quite easy just to chop it down and then just take it to our compost. So that's how most things are removed on our farm. And one exception is arugula. This is the one crop that is kind of direct sown, but it's not removed completely during harvest. So we place a silage tarp over it for anywhere between 1 to 3 weeks, depending on what time of year it is. During the height of summer, it dies pretty fast, so about a week. So when we're preparing a bed under a no-till system, and this is, I think it's pretty unique to our farm. I've never seen a farm use mulch as extensively as us, but basically we first have to remove the mulch off the bed to be able to do anything to the bed. So it either just gets raked to the side, just in the path, if it's going right back on, or if it's going to be direct sown with carrots or turnips or things like that, then we completely remove the mulch off the bed. And we broad fork the bed. We go down one side of the bed, and then we go down the other side of the bed. So we're not having to step on the bed. And then once it's broad forked, we fertilize and add compost if we have compost to add. And then we rake it smooth like our employee Ellen is doing here in the picture. And then the mulch is placed back on the bed. So it's pretty simple and all hand powered. So with new plots, what we do is we put a silage trap down for, and this is really important, it's for an entire year, not for 3 months of the summer or 5 months or 6 months. Like it literally has to be an entire year to get the benefit of putting a silage trap down, because that will kill your perennial weeds, which is important, and also exhaust some of the annual weed seed bank. So it's really important to deplete like all that energy stored in the roots of weeds. So that happens for a year, and then we can remove it. And we've done it differently over the years, but the beds that we formed in the new high tunnel, we did it this way. We basically tarped for a year, removed it, and we have a heavy duty broad fork that we don't typically use for bed prep. That's just, you can't break it. So we use that just in case that we do have rocks in the soil. So we use the heavy duty broad fork to first loosen the soil. We do like to add some bulk compost to the beds initially, just for that first year. This kind of protects the native soil underneath, and also if you are lacking in organic matter, it's a great opportunity to boost your organic matter levels in that way. And that's basically it. Obviously, you have to add in some amendments like lime or anything to fix your pH or other nutrient levels. So that's your chance to do it then. And it's as simple as that. And basically, you want to weed diligently for a couple of years. You definitely don't want anything going to seed. And at a few years in, it's going to be relatively weed free. And that's one of the huge benefits of no-till in our scenario. So, I'm talking about maybe less than 10 man hours weeding for the entire season our vegetable beds. So that's why we have time to spend on cover cropping and compost making, which we'll be talking about next. I mean, we wouldn't be able to create time for that if there was a lot of weeding to do. So it really just all fits in together. Just look at the time. Okay, perfect.
We have a question in the chat. So there is a question about solarization. And I'm wondering if you can maybe discern like tarping, solarization. And then also the follow-up question is, doesn't solarization kill beneficial organisms as well?
Yeah, great question. So definitely there's different, and I should mention, there's silage tarps, which are the 5 mil or 6 mil solid plastic, which I was talking about earlier. But there's also landscape fabric, which are woven and it lets water through, but and air, but not sunlight. So that can actually be used in place of silage tarps too for that this part for new plots. Solarization is something we're going to be covering during the cover crop section, because that's how we kill our spring and summer cover crops. We don't typically use it for cash crops because we don't really have a need for them. The reason why arugula is tarped for us to terminate is because our beds are so close together that sometimes when we try to solarize, the bed next to it has a cash crop that has a canopy that's shading the arugula. So it doesn't fully kind of kill the edges. So the tarp is just so much easier to just make sure it's completely dead. And that's why we choose that. But when it comes to solarization damaging some of the soil life, it's been researched and by different organizations, but basically it really depends on how long it's on for, and kind of how hot it is, I presume. And also we make sure that when we put the clear plastic on, there is debris. There's basically the mown cover crop debris, and then there's mulch underneath it, like hay mulch, and then there's the soil. So it's really the clear plastic is not in direct contact with the soil. So that obviously helps too. But we try not to have the clear plastic on for more than a day, or more than necessary, because if it's a hot day, sunny, above 75, it should die in one day. So you don't want to put it on for more than it needs. So, maybe 2 days max. But once you have it on for more than a day, that's when it starts affecting your soil life, is what I've heard from other organizations doing research on this. So, looking through the microscope and actually studying it. So.
Thank you. We have another question, and I was curious about this too, because a lot of folks, right, who are no-till have like done an initial till. Am I hearing that you don't do an initial till at all? And then there is this question in the chat. I'm wondering how using what was it? The HTE broad fork. I forget what you called your
Oh, the heavy duty one?
the heavy duty broad fork to loosen soil is different from tilling.
Tilling is really, it means you are inversing soil layers. If you're broad forking, you're just creating kind of, you know, air channels in the soil. So not inverting the soil. And in terms of the new plot, so the high tunnel beds that we created this spring, that's the method that I described was for that. So silage trough for an entire year, take it off. Broad fork with the, it's called Meadow Creature is the heavy duty broad fork, I believe. So we use that, put amendments down, put compost down, and then broad fork, once we're ready to put in a cash crop, we'll broad fork again, but with the regular broad fork. So it's like just any, you know, it would just be the standard bed prep from that point. So that worked. That might have worked just because it's a small area, like a high tunnel. So if you were to do an entire like acre or something, that might not be super practical. So in that case, you could definitely till initially, and I would not, you know, feel bad about it because it's really fine. I mean, just once, if you're not repeatedly doing it, I think it's totally fine. And it's an opportunity to remove a lot of rocks, which, you know, we had a lot of. So there are other benefits to doing that initial tillage. So don't shy away from that if you need to do it. Should I move on?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So next breakout session. So the question is, what cover crops, because we're moving into the cover crop section, what cover crops are you familiar with and how have you managed them? What changes, if any, have you seen on your soil or crops from cover cropping? Is everyone back? All right. Anything interesting that you guys shared?
Hello.
Hi.
So, sorry. Okay. So, the things that we came up with, we're a group, but we all have separate tickets, but we're joined on just this one account, just for clarification. My name's Akila, not Brendan. But we said nitrogen fixing plants. And we've seen people chop and drop those, or chop and drop and mix in the soil and cover it with a tarp. Those are a couple ways that I've seen that. Did I answer the question?
Is that all by hand?
Yes.
Chop, drop, and okay.
Yeah, like small scale urban gardens.
Right. Awesome.
Okay.
Did you say what?
Oh, was there more?
Did you say what crop you put?
I don't know.
I can share. I have limited experience with cover cropping, but I have in the past, at the suggestion of a soil scientist friend, gave me this great idea. And I was doing this on a small scale. I don't know anyone who's done it on a large scale, but I grew peas and oats, planted them as a cover crop in, I think it was late August. And then I planted my fall, like planted garlic into it, and then allowed the the peas and oats to winter kill and act as a mulch for the garlic. And it worked successfully. So I was really happy that that actually worked my first time using a cover crop.
Oh, awesome. Anybody have successful cover crop experiences like Bree? Or anybody have not successful experiences? Any challenges, failures?
I have a challenge. With my cover cropping situation in my backyard, I don't know if it's a problem, but like the birds are getting to it before it can grow. So,
Are they
and I
getting
feel,
seeds?
sorry, go on.
Are they eating the seeds?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'd imagine that people also face critters in their farms and green spaces. But that's definitely a challenge that I've come up against, like wanting the natural ecosystem to exist there, but also like having trouble not even like seeing the growth to begin with.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I'll definitely cover some ways you can avoid that. So, all right, maybe we should get started, Bree, since there's not a ton of time. Okay, so diving right in, I'd like to start with why it's useful to cover crop. Obviously, photosynthesis is feeding the soil. It's the root exudates are literally feeding the life in the soil, which it just has all sorts of benefits from that, including, you know, improving soil structure, improving water drainage and water retention, nutrient retention. So all these kind of help to just improve your soil structure and just your soil overall. And like I mentioned earlier, this is where on our farm, we really get to introduce species diversity. We have anywhere from 8 to 12 species in each set that you'll see in another slide. But for every part of the season, I have a different group of species that we use, and every different species is feeding a different set of microbes in the soil. So the more diversity you have of plants, the more diversity that you are nurturing in the soil. Obviously, living roots help to prevent erosion, and like one of you mentioned about the nitrogen fixing plants. It can mean that you have to use less fertilizer for your following cash crop. To me, it's also, I always love to see, you know, a field of green whenever during the season. So it's also beautiful. So when do we cover crops? So we are in, at this point, I think our zone changed, so I'm not even sure anymore. But where we are, we start seeding as early as even late March, but I've written here early April. It's getting warmer and warmer every year, so you know this might start shifting pretty quickly. But our spring cover crops are sown early April to early May, and then we switch into summer cover crops starting around mid-May. And we have two different kinds of summer cover crops. So if there's an interval that's longer than 3 weeks, then we put in ones that need a little bit more time to develop. So I call it the long summer cover crop. And if there's only an interval of less than 3 weeks, we use the short summer cover crops. Those are, of course, things like buckwheat. And then I included overseeding here. We don't do this all the time, but it is great to sprinkle some small seeds like clover into beds of cash crops that you know are going to go until the end of the season. So something like kale, you can just sprinkle some clover seeds, just, you know, just broadcast on your kale beds, and you'll have a nice growth underneath that will take you through the winter. And in the fall, we see two different types. One's winter kill and one's overwintering. And those, we really push the limits of when you sow them. So the winter kill, we go honestly up until mid-October at this point. And then the overwintering, we go up until early November, actually. So this is slightly outdated, but basically we're not looking to have, you know, massive plants before the winter sets in. Even if it's just a couple of inches, that's great. That's still, you know, photosynthesis. That's still holding the mulch together, the soil together. And so any chance we get, we are cover cropping, which means, and this is kind of, you can take a screenshot, or this is just an idea of what we're sowing, but I like to, you know, reiterate that it does not have to be this at all. It can be whatever is accessible to you. And honestly, it doesn't really matter what it is. If you have a ton of seeds left over and they're maybe not quite, you know, good quality for, you know, to use as a cash crop, you can use that. Any amount of seeds from any seeds are good as a cover crop. So you can see we have like okra in here, sesame. You just want to pay attention to obviously what will, like, for instance, in a winter kill, I want to make sure that none of these species are going to live through the winter. Although last winter was so mild that a lot of our winter kill did survive. So that's a bit of a challenge. But other than that, it really doesn't matter what you put in here. You just want to make sure those species are going to thrive in those seasons. So how do we seed our cover crops? I think there's not a ton of don't think I've seen other farms do this, but we kind of stumbled upon it a few years ago, which we were like, hey, this is super easy to do. And so basically we broadcast the seeds and mulch on top of it. And that's it. So before, we were doing a lot of additional steps like broad forking and fertilizing, because I heard from a farmer that he treats cash crops, cover crops, like cash crops. So we were treating it that way. But since we do a crazy amount of cover cropping, we have since removed this step, and I think the benefit is still the same. And they grow just as well. So in our case, yeah, if there's already mulch on the bed, you'll rake it aside, broadcast the seeds, and then you'll just put the mulch back on. And don't forget to water, because I see a lot of farms where they sow the cover crops and walk away and hope that it rains. You might as well just set up some sprinklers or just water it in. And so this is the part where if you don't have access to mulch, we have tried these things with success. So you can cover your bed with row cover, and the birds can't eat it, and it keeps it moist enough that it germinates. So that's one way. We used to have trouble with birds eating seeds, but if it's mulched, they don't go after it at all. But that's an option. Another thing that we've done is if you don't want to use mulch, you can use a seeder. Any kind of seeder will do. Just kind of run through the bed so that it kind of covers the seeds a little bit, and makes it less obvious that it's there. So how we terminate cover crops, is it depends on what season it is. So overwintered cover crops. So this is your winter rye, your hairy vetch, and there's all sorts of things in our overwintered, but it's pretty like winter rye. I don't know if you guys have worked with winter rye, but it's pretty powerful in the spring. And we've tried terminating in so many different ways, and we've settled on just tarping it before it gets too tall. And it's just the easiest, most trouble-free way of killing winter rye. Because once winter rye gets more than maybe 6 inches tall, it's just really hard to kill. So that's kind of our method. And it's nice because once you take off the tarp, it's ready to plant into. There's no crazy like root balls in the soil. There's no allelopathic effects happening. It's just much easier to work with. So for spring and summer cover crops, this is where we solarize. So we mow it like in this picture, and we put, all these pictures are an example of solarization. So we mow it, and then we put this plastic, clear plastic on. And like I said, no more than a day if you, if it's nice and sunny. And in this bottom picture, you'll see that that's what the soil looks like after you remove the clear plastic. So sometimes there's more debris than not, depending on how tall your cover crops got before. Even if it gets really tall, the solarization, it's not, you can direct sow into it, you can do anything to it, and it's not usually a problem. This is just an example of one of our fields. This is a view of our field map. You can see all the cover crops in gray here and our cash crops in color. And you can see we fit at least 2 cover crops in a season, usually every bed. Some beds get 3 cover crops per season on top of the cash crop. So you can just imagine how much cover cropping we do. So, and I want to mention that we do see like visually just how beneficial cover cropping is. I mean, most of our really heavy feeding kind of fall crops are followed by, it comes after a summer cover crop. So we like to kind of like block an entire field with, summer cover crops, and then our fall crops follow that. And it's just, it's almost always after that, everything grows really well. I mean, in general, every year, everything grows better, which is great to see. I mean, for instance, like lettuce, we're planting 22 successions of lettuce every year. And, before, years ago, we used to see some differences in how each of them grow. But now it's so consistent, like every single succession is just like grows really well. So it's just great to see that consistency and predictability there for what how your crops are going to grow. Let me just look at the time. Okay. Any questions about cover cropping? I'm about to jump in.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions in the chat. So I think this was when you were talking about planting the cover crops. There was this question that came up about what do you use for mulch, hay, wood chips, etc.
Okay. So the mulch we use is salt marsh hay. It's actually hayed by one guy north of Boston. So it's hay, which I do think it's a little bit more nutritious than straw, but I mean, anything works. It doesn't matter. Whatever is, accessible in your area is totally fine. And you can see on our farm, it gets reused, as in, it doesn't get mixed into the soil or anything. So of course, there's always decomposition happening throughout the season. So whatever you put down in the spring, maybe only half of it is left when you're removing the crop. But we're always adding more on. Yeah, we go through maybe about 120 bales or so per season. So it's a big part of our farm.
Next question is, which is most effective, clear or white plastic for solarization or black plastic?
Well, solarization by definition is clear plastic. You're letting the sunlight come through and using the heat of the sunlight to kill the plants. Tarping is using a black solid tarp that's called occultation, and that is removing sunlight, the opposite of solarization. And it's got different uses as you can see. Solarization is very quick. It's in a day. Tarping takes at least a week, even at the height of the season, depending on what you're killing. But it has different uses. So yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions on cover cropping before we move on? All right.
All right. Okay, so our last section is about compost and compost teas. So yeah, I'd like to preface this by saying we started off our first couple of years applying the deep compost method, which you'll hear a lot within the no-till world. It's when you apply, several inches of compost on your field, your beds. And although we didn't put several inches, it was definitely maybe half an inch or so in our case, but we considered it was to us a lot of compost. So we used to do that. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're starting off with really low organic matter, I think it's a great way to boost your organic matter levels very quickly. So I think this method is really great in those scenarios. And also it does definitely help to bury weeds. If you're applying that much compost, you're essentially like killing those weeds, or not killing, but you're what's the word? You're like burying them so they can't grow. So it's kind of, multi-purpose in that way. And but we since then moved on from the deep compost method. We've found a few like troublesome aspects of the deep compost method, which is typically compost that you buy in bulk. So this is like 30, 40, 80, 90 yards of compost that you're bringing in. And unless you know your compost operation intimately, you don't really know what's going into making that compost. So even in our first year or two, we were getting compost with tons of trash in it. And obviously that's not great, but what you really want to avoid is something like persistent herbicides, because that can like shut your farm down. You wouldn't be able to grow anything for years. So because of not being able to verify compost being clean, we wanted to move away from purchased compost to making our own compost. And and this, I want to make clear, we're not trying to make yards and yards of compost, which eventually I think we are actually going to get to a place where we do make a significant amount, but not in the amounts of like the deep compost method, what you would need for the deep compost method. So we're aiming to make compost that is like very high quality. So you don't need large amounts of it. It's more to inoculate your soil with beneficial microbes and to be able to make teas and extracts from it. Because in order to make compost teas and extracts that are going to be effective, you need to start off with high quality compost. And also, making your own compost ensures diversity of microbes too, because we ensure that the inputs are diverse as well. Okay, so we started off this composting system in 2021 after taking Elaine Ingham's soil food web course online that previous winter. And And this is exactly how she kind of explains it in her course. And it's very approachable. A lot of the materials are very cheap to build out these systems. And it was, yeah, it was great for the years that we did it like this. We are moving on to a slightly different system. So we got some grant funding to purchase a electric loader. So mostly specifically for compost making, so that we don't have to have as much manual labor in making compost. But if you're a farm that has volunteers or just a lot of young people willing to do the work, I think this method is great. Yeah, we're kind of, when we applied for the grant, we calculated the average age of our crew, and it was in the 40s. So we're like, we need, something that's a little bit more sustainable for our bodies. But this way is what I am going to be explaining today. And hopefully by next year, we're going to have our new what's called a static aerated system up and running, so that we can share through workshops and whatnot the effectiveness of that model. But yeah, this method is thermophilic piles on pallets. So we make sure all parts of the pile are heat treated for pathogens and weed seeds and things like that. It's got a very quick turnaround of a couple of months. Definitely some experts on composting recommend like a curing stage that's much longer, which I think is great for the microbes. But we found that looking at our microscope, there's plenty of beneficial life in the ones that are coming off of these pellets after a couple months. So, and we used to do, weekly piles of these. So one of these piles per week, which contains about 30 to 40 buckets, 5-gallon buckets. So in terms of our ingredients, we have high nitrogen sources and greens and browns. So years ago, we used to get our friends chicken manure. We no longer do that. So everything is basically plant-based for our compost. And it's been replaced by grass clippings. So basically just mowing the grassy area on our farm, and we can get tons of grass clippings. So that's a great high nitrogen source. And obviously all the veggie scraps on the farm go into the compost. We also forage for some greens from the surrounding areas just to boost that diversity in the compost. And then finally, the browns can be leaves, wood chips, chipped branches. Here our employee is using our chipper shredder and shredding some woody crops that came out of the field. Could be like okra or, woody broccoli or something like that. So the ratio of the ingredients matter, and it depends on the season, but this is our basic recipe. So you have 10% are grass clippings, 30% are veggie scraps, and 60% are browns. And a word about new wood chips. It's ideally you don't use new wood chips too much. You want to let the wood chips sit for a year or two before you use them, just because it's just so, undecomposed. It takes a lot to decompose those wood chips. So, and by the time you have aged wood chips, there should be a lot of mycorrhizae already forming on those. So, we try to have aged wood chips as much as possible. And wood chips are great because it adds structure to the compost and provides those sort of air pockets and ensuring that oxygen is available for the compost, all parts of the compost. And then of course there's leaves and hay. So this is the process in which you build the compost. So at the initial pile building, you gather ingredients and you want to soak your ingredients overnight. You group, they all go into 5-gallon buckets. So you can know exactly what the ratio is. And then when you're ready to build the pile, you want to group it into 3 equal piles, drain out the water, and one by one, you want to mix it onto a tarp, which you then mix with a fork, and make sure you remove any clumps. And you want to do a squeeze test to make sure it's the right moisture. So just if you squeeze it really tight, you should get a drop or 2, but that's about it. And then you want to cover with a tarp and make sure rainwater doesn't, get in. And so from that point on, you have to monitor the temperature daily. Sometimes it shoots up really quickly. Sometimes it could be really slow. So you want to monitor that on a spreadsheet. And then depending on the temperature, your first turn is determined. So, if it's between 131 and 150, you want to let it sit for 3 days and so on. So, and then if it gets above 175, just make sure you poke some holes into it. You don't want it to catch on fire, which it definitely can. Then what you do is, like in this picture, there's 3 sections. You want to make sure every section goes into that hot center to get heat treated, which is to, kill the pathogens and kill the weed seeds. So you're basically shuffling these sections in the next 2 turns so that each section goes into that hot center. And finally, once you're done with that final turn and all the compost comes down to ambient temperature, it's ready to use. You want to kind of check for smell. It shouldn't stink. It should smell earthy and nice. It should be a brown color. And then so through the soil food web course, you learn how to use a microscope and identify different microbes. And so we used to do that for every compost, make sure there's no bad organisms and that it's full of life. So in terms of application, we have direct application, which is to directly apply the compost onto the beds. And we still do that today. We put about 2 5-gallon buckets of compost per 100-foot bed, which again, it's a real sprinkle, but it's meant to be an inoculant to introduce the diverse microbes into the bed. We like to broad fork prior to spreading the compost, just to make sure it gets as incorporated as much as possible under a no-till system. The bed is normally mulched afterwards. And we usually the compost becomes ready more so later in the summer. So when it becomes available, then we start using it during bed prep. And you can also side dress large summer plants like tomatoes and cucumbers, peppers, okra, and put it by the base of the plant. And it's always good to cover with mulch so it doesn't just dry up. And finally, on my last slide, we'll talk about compost tea, which will take you much further than obviously sprinkling directly the compost. So to make tea, it is really important that you have high quality compost. Like I said, if you know how to use a microscope, there are microscopy courses happening, definitely in Connecticut this winter and into next year. So I'm assuming other states might be also offering that. It's CT NOFA that's offering that here. And I think microscopy is becoming more and more prevalent amongst farmers. So definitely look out for courses. I think it's really just eye-opening to look at your soil and see what's there or what's not there. You know, sometimes it's like in the beginning when we first started using microscopes, if there was a crop that wasn't doing well, you know, be curious and look under a microscope and find that there's like not much life happening, you know. So it's always important to check your soil and your compost before using it for compost tea, so you're not wasting your effort on building this whole thing. And of course, it's also very important to check your finished tea under a microscope to make sure you're spraying beneficials onto your plants. So in our case, we typically use about 75% compost or homemade compost and 25% of our vermicompost, which we keep in a separate room. Yeah, put that in our, you can use a 5-gallon bucket. Right now we have a 35-gallon brewer. So we typically add the compost as well as a tablespoon of kelp meal and fish hydrolysate, humates if you have it. And then we brew for a minimum of 24 hours. And we used to do it once a week, but we kind of fell behind this year. But definitely you kind of see amazing results like in this picture. We sprayed these cucumbers every week and it produced 600 pounds in a 100-foot bed last year. So it was probably one of our best cucumber plantings, and it got a weekly dose of the compost tea. When you do use a backpack sprayer, this is, you know, typically a 4-gallon sprayer. We put in 1 gallon of the tea and then you dilute it down with just water. And we apply it typically to cucumbers and tomatoes. And the backpack will cover about 400 to 600 bed feet, depending on, you know, how big your plants are. And yeah, make sure, you know, you coat it both top and underside of the leaves. And alternative methods that we've used, definitely watering can is super easy. If it's something that's like low growing, it's really beneficial to apply to your soil as well. So it, you know, even if it runs down and just drenches the soil, that's great. This year we used a lot of sprinklers, so we just put it through our wobblers, and it definitely cut down on walking everywhere on the farm. So I think we will continue using sprinklers for application. And it covers, you know, the whole farm very quickly. So that's about it for me. I think that leaves a little bit of time for Q&A, but we have been taking questions as we go. So hopefully we can cover everything, all the questions we have.
Thank you. Yeah, we do have a question in the chat from Clarice. So when you apply the tea, are you applying to the leaves or the root of the plant?
So the leaves, definitely the leaves. Obviously some of it might drip down and go into the soil. That's great. But compost tea it's like a sticky substance. It's really great at like sticking to surfaces. So yeah, it's much more effective if you put it on the leaves, because that's much more direct than going through the roots.
All right, looks like we have another question in the chat. Do you all mix the browns together with a ratio before adding to the active pile, or do you keep the browns separated from each other and then eyeball the amount?
So when we're building the initial pile, that's when we mix everything, all the greens and the browns and the high nitrogen together on a piece of tarp, and we're kind of mixing it all together. So if we have, let's say, like a 30 bucket pile, so we have 10 buckets, 3 groups of 10 buckets, because you can't, do all of it at once. So within the 10 buckets, you're going to have 1 bucket that's high nitrogen, 3 buckets that's your vegetable scraps, and then 6 buckets that are browns. So you're going to put, you know, 1 by 1, those 10 buckets onto a tarp, and you mix it all together. And then you put what's mixed into the little fenced in area. And then you repeat that for, group 2, group 3.
Sarah, did that get at I know you had a couple follow-up questions, but I think maybe they were answered. Okay. Any other questions? And feel free to take yourself off of mute and ask the question yourself if you'd like.
I have a question about the cover cropping.
Sure.
So when you broadcast the seeds, you said mulch on top. I'm wondering, so like obviously the seeds will still grow even though there's mulch covering, like light is still able to come in.
Right, good question. There is definitely a art to applying mulch. So obviously you don't want to mulch heavily, but most things can get through mulch. They're gonna find the light and they're gonna come up through the mulch. So unless you put down a significant amount of mulch, they're gonna find their way through. But
Thank you.
when we first started mulching, we actually put down a much thicker layer. And what happened was rodents really like to live under it. And so we've since then scaled back kind of the depth of the mulch, and we've just arrived at this like perfect kind of thickness that we use for everything. So whether it be we're mulching this cucumber bed or we're mulching for a cover crop, it's just, the perfect amount. So I tell our employees, like, you kind of like want to just be able to see the soil,
I'm sorry, was that roaches or rodents?
Rodents.
Oh, rodents. Okay.
Yep. So yeah, in that case, it was like rats and voles and things like that.
Yeah.
Voles mostly.
And you said you found like a good thickness of it, like just
Yeah,
by like experimentation. Like
yeah.
I also had a question. At our farm, we did lay down cover crop, but it definitely got overpowered by a lot of weeds, like just like the lamb's quarter was just like very prominent among the cover crop. Like, was that like an issue like you guys went through like at a certain point where there was just like the weeds were just like out of control?
Actually, that's a really good point that, I forgot to mention. So obviously this cover cropping system developed like in the last 3-4 years. Our first couple of years we were so focused on starting the farm and getting our crops in that we did a very minimal amount of cover cropping. So I think during those first year or two is when we had the most amount of weeds. And I think by the time we really started doing a lot of cover cropping, our weeds were under control. And I want to, mention that it's really important to weed your cover crop beds. I always mention that in workshops and tours because, that's the place that they're going to thrive. Nobody sees you, and they're just gonna grow happily and set a lot of seeds. So definitely treat it like a cash crop in that way. Make sure you and your employees can tell apart which ones are cover crops and which ones are weeds, and stay on top of it.
I'm sorry. It's okay to keep asking.
Yeah.
That um like were you guys manually weeding that the weeds
That's-
out of the cover crop?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So how we weed is we always have a bucket. It's pretty important to put your weeds in a bucket because it can reroot very quickly. So we like to always either like throw in a path or on a tarp if it's nearby, but somewhere that's not gonna touch the soil or even the mulch, it's gonna reroot. So
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks, y'all. We are coming to the end of our time, and we do need to wrap on time just to honor everyone's time. I do see another couple of questions in the chat that we can address. We always send a follow-up email so we can ask Yoko to answer those questions if they have time, if you have time, and then we can send those out with the follow-up email. So yeah, if you have any other questions too, feel free to send them to programs@soulfirefarm.org, and we can get those questions answered as well. Yeah, but thanks you all for joining. Yoko, do you have any last words for everyone before we wrap up?
No, but yeah, feel free to contact me if you have more questions. I'm definitely happy to help and see more growers do more cover cropping and composting. So thank you.
Thank you. And Shay has shared some links in the chat, both links to follow Yoko and Asawaga Farm on Instagram, and also a link to our program Eva, which we all know everybody always loves, but we do look at those and we use them for planning future programs. So please give us your share your input and any topics that you'd like to see in future programs. But yeah, we are just gonna wrap up now since we're a minute over. And if you feel like coming off mute and just sharing like a word, like something that you're taking away from today's program, or you can share it in the chat as well. And then we will leave after that.
Hopeful.
Grounded.
I see Clarice says knowledge in the chat. All right, we will leave it there. Thanks you all so much. And yeah, just keep an eye to your inbox for that follow-up email, which should come out in the next couple of days. And we'll also send a recording of the workshop as well.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks.